So why were we so confident about all this borrowing? Why were people lending us all of this money? And why is it that every now and then, compared to other African countries, we get into trouble so regularly, and it's all about not being able to sustain our debt and all of that? A lot of that has been this belief that we are a very wealthy country, we are destined for greatness, somehow we are on the path to becoming a very important country in the world. It started all the way from Osagifo, even before Osagifo. That sense of national pride and the fact that we are on the path to doing something really great. The problem is that it's not reflecting in the reality to the extent that it will match that whole vision. You see, so when you look at 1950, this is how much of our money came from cocoa. So at that point, the story that, look, we can't rely on cocoa alone. We have much more potential. We have minerals, we have land, we have arable land, we have agricultural potential, etc. A lot of that was true in a sense, because if you look at it, cocoa in the 1950s was just too predominant in the economy, too dominant. And then over time, we managed to shift to as low as around 50% and 40% in the mid-70s and the rest. So other factors of production were becoming more dominant. Other sources of revenue become more dominant. The problem is that since cocoa became less important, and you can see that by the time we hit the 90s, after structural reform and the rest of it, cocoa was now around 20%, the total share of exports. By the time we hit the present, yes, cocoa is still around 20%, so it's similar to what it was in 1995. The difference, though, is that the other things that have come up to make cocoa less important are not that different from cocoa in the way they behave economically. So gold and oil. And when you add gold, oil, and cocoa, almost 90% of all the revenue we make externally is accounted for. What does that mean? It means that we've moved from a monocrop economy to a commodities-dependent economy. Still natural resources. What it means is that the pace at which you're able to transform the economy is highly limited in many respects. One, you are dependent on international prices for these items. It's not based on, things that are particularly within your control. Secondly, the way that they get produced. If you think of gold, the technology component of it does not sit in Ghana. Even the top engineers, yes, though some of them may be Ghanaian, but a lot of the technology and the advancement in the technology is purely imported in. So by the time you've done producing the gold, you've not really added as much value as you could. And it does not have enough connections to the rest of your economy, the linkages to other sectors of the economy. It does not transform other types of skill profiles. So there's so many reasons why just being natural resource is a problem. That notwithstanding, we've kept this whole thing going about Ghana is on the verge of takeoff. We are on the path to Singapore, Malaysia. We've kept it in the way that we structure our policy making. So it may not be reflected on the ground, but we behave like that. And that is why when you look at 2021, for instance, there's something we call the gross financing needs. The gross financing needs is essentially what the government feels the public sector needs to run the country. And you have something in the region of almost 110 billion. So you say, for me to run Ghana, I need 110 billion Ghana cedis. You get the point? But the problem is that your taxes are just 56 billion. Right? You get other revenues in the form of royalties and other things that are not pure taxes, but are still money to the government, around 14%. You borrow some local money. And then you rely on foreigners to meet the rest. Then you encounter a crisis as we have now. And we say, okay, in 2022, how will you do things? And they say, you know what? Actually, I need 136 billion now. And I will raise 80 billion in tax. What is important in these two sets of charts is the fact that, one, the ambition has not been moderated. There's a sense as if we are magic. I'll still spend 136 billion.
The government said they will cut down their expenditure to that respect.
Well, they said they will cut 20%, but nobody knows how they will cut it. But they've costed this, right? So they must now tell us what you take off. On top of that, why are you going to get 80 billion of taxes from 56 billion to 80 billion? Is it going to just spring up like magic? And when you take that behavior into account, the way you analyze it to the point where you really understand what is going on is to compare it to other places. Because a lot of time they talk as if Ghana is an island. And it makes it very difficult to have a debate, because what they'll do is that they go and compare it to some other government in Ghana's own history. So we're not really, it's like we're in this little cocoon and we're not understanding what is happening in Ghana because we don't have perspective. You should step back and have perspective. These are the countries that are rated worse than us. So we're complaining about the ratings, right? We're complaining about the ratings that Moody's and Fitch and the rest gave it to us. I chose a couple of countries that Fitch, Moody's and the rest say are doing badly than we are doing. When you look at how much we spend of our revenue paying debt, paying back all this money that we are borrowing to spend as lavishly as we do, look at the gap between us and the next person, the next country, sorry. You see the problem. So you see that we've risen from about 10%, using about 10% of all our government revenue in 1990 to pay and service our debt, to nearly 40%. In fact, actually, it's actually more than 40% right now. And yet still, Togo and all of these people, countries that are rated badly than us, are spending far less. So once you get out of the Ghana bubble, and you look at what other countries are doing, we are doing some very strange things in this country. And these are the absolute benchmarks. You should not be spending more than 40% of the exports you make servicing debt. Sorry, 15% servicing debt. And 18% servicing revenue. This is the kind of like the technocratic benchmark. The experts have sat down and said, if you run and come in our part of the world, emerging markets, frontier economies, try and keep your spending requirements to within these limits.
So what do you make of the report that the president made at AU with regards to the rating agency? Because consistently, he said that the rating
has against us, they don't understand what they're doing. I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that if the experts say that don't spend more than 15% of your 18% of your revenue on debt, and you are spending 36% to 40% or more, there's a problem.
Okay.
Then we start getting noticed. So even the countries that are ranked the West, countries like Belize, DRC, and the rest, the rating agencies still see that even they are not spending as much of the economy paying and servicing their debt as we are. You see that gap. So we get to the two issues that you keep hinting at, whether it is about COVID and whether the rating agencies are somehow biased against us, and that has led to this current temporary crisis, which I don't believe is temporary, as I've already made known. You can see how our debt was being seen long before COVID. This is from 2015. You can see that already, compared to the average for other peer countries like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and emerging markets, we were being seen as way riskier. So that is evident long before COVID. This has nothing to do with COVID, 2015 to today. And already we are diverging again. But we are diverging so frighteningly, it's back to the crisis period when there was a change in government and the doomsday situation had led to a fall in confidence in the economy. The other thing is that it was so bad that globally it was significant, which is the other thing that we don't seem to get. This is the spreads worldwide and the spreads continentally. You can see that our spreads compared to Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and everything was very high. And our situation as West performers were sovereign. West performance was a global
All these were before COVID.
These were all before COVID. The question would then be, okay, maybe we did something particularly incredible during COVID, which we had to do, and which other places didn't have to do. That would be the only reason you can give that will make the COVID argument sound. If you look at how we spend on social spending, which therefore, if you have COVID, it will trigger because people are not working, you have to give them welfare. We are not even among the biggest in Africa in social spending. Compared to Kenya, Senegal, Rwanda, this IMF data, by the way. We are not even that big in social spending. And then when COVID hit, it reflected. We had to raise our spending a little bit more. But even so, compared to West Africa, compared to emerging markets, we're a bit higher than West Africa, but significantly lower than other emerging markets, and far lower than the Senegals, the Benin, the Ethiopians, the Kenyans, and the rest. So why didn't they have the same degree of problems we had, right? If you're not spending a lot in response to COVID, why are you saying that COVID is your big problem? And then when you look at the actual impact of COVID on our economy, this is Ghana, right? Economic growth slowed down to about 0.2%, which was significant because normally we get like 4% the rate. But look at how badly some people did. They had contraction. The economy became smaller.
For Angola, I see negative.
30%. The economy, they lost a third of the economy. You know, countries like the Seychelles and the rest of it, Mauritius and the rest, huge problems. So if these countries are not getting into trouble with the rating agencies and they are not almost defaulting on their debt, and then you can't make the argument that COVID is the problem. Because we see the effect of COVID on the country's GDP growth. These are numbers. These are not opinions. And then when we look at the total spending as a percentage of the economy, because you can't just look at absolutes, look at it compared to the economy. You find out that we are nowhere near Mauritius, right? Mauritius spent what? 30-something% to fight COVID of its whole GDP, right? Even Burkina Faso spent more than us. Senegal spent more than us. So you cannot make the argument that it's COVID because the numbers doesn't show that, one, you suffered enough from COVID, and that, two, you had to respond more aggressively than other countries. And then you say, okay, but the ratings...
Before you go to that, the ratings being biased, you've shown us the pictorial view of how much we spend compared to other African countries. But
no, this is global. So you are looking at emerging markets. African countries is behind here.
Interesting. And what do you make of the debate as in whether we should have accountability with regards to how much we spent during that period? Because the huge conversation consistently before Parliament, even before
it was not what we spent that was the issue. We received more than most other countries. We received $2 billion from the IMF. A lot of the other countries didn't get that much. If we go through the numbers and look at how much other countries got from the IMF, because of our relative size, we got a lot more money. And the World Bank has now disclosed that they gave us an additional $430 million that most people didn't know about. So we got a lot of money to help us with our response to COVID. So accountability is in respect of that. What did you use that money for? Because those were concessional, very low interest. Sometimes with a grace period of like 5 years, 10 years, and things like that. Right? But when it comes to how much we spent compared to others spent way more than we did.
So there
are two different arguments.
Does that drain the call by the finance minister that we should let's both go through the struggle as a nation and help the recovery process?
Well, there's nothing that they are spending now that is necessarily COVID. That's the point I'm trying to make. In 2020, 2021, when this was the case, they were already spending less than other African countries. Today, how much are they spending in contact tracing? Free health care for sick people. We had one of the shortest lockdowns. Uganda closed schools for almost 2 years and was still paying teachers. There are countries in this region where they gave food and other relief measures for a year. We tried it for 3 weeks and we got tired. You get the point? So the argument I'm making is that when it comes to spending, actually that's not where the issue was. We spent less. The issue was revenue that came because of COVID. Money that we assigned claiming is for COVID.
So COVID should rather have saved us, exactly. Looking at the real true picture that you painted.
That is where I'm directing towards. Okay. Of course, we had a big hit to tourism. They closed the hotels. But you have to look at the proportion of our economy that is tourism versus a country like Mauritius, Seychelles, Cape Verde, where they have like 20% of their proportion of the economy being tourism. And then the fact that in the same period that you had issues to do with airport closure and the rest, you are also not spending in some other areas because people were home. So you have to balance all of that. And then the hit, whatever the hit is, will reflect in your GDP. And I'll prove to you, when we go here, that our GDP hit was limited, showing that COVID effect in Ghana was way limited. How much we had to lose as a result of GDP growth, foregone GDP growth, was much less than some other countries that really lost massively. Look at this side versus this side. You get it? So that is the argument I'm trying to make. And then when you take all that into account, reflect on the fact that we didn't spend as much, but we got a lot more money and the rest of it. COVID, while it was bad, cannot be blamed for structural problems that I've explained up to date. In terms of whether or not the ratings were biased, the evidence show that the countries that historically have defaulted more tend to be the ones that struggle with ratings over time. It's not perfect, but it's generally the case. So given that Ghana, as I was showing you on the throughout the chart, has gone back to credit and say, I can't pay. Every now and then I can't pay. Of course, if I'm lending you money, I will charge you more. And if I'm a rating agency, I'll be more careful what kind of ratings I give you. Because if I don't give you ratings that reflect your truth, and somebody lends money to you because of that, and you default, my methodology becomes less effective. So to give you an example, Moody's left Mali, I think 2012. They dropped Mali from their ratings because they said they were, the situation was bad, and they were not giving them the right responses in terms of what they intended to do. Very soon thereafter, Mali defaulted. So my point is that yes, they have their issues, the rating agencies, they are not saints, but you have to understand that it's based on numbers, and some of those numbers didn't look good before they downgraded us already. Which brings us to IMF very quickly. I think the issue with the IMF thing is a bit of a red herring, and I'll very quickly explain why. The IMF issue is interesting because, first of all, we need to take into account that IMF packages are not one thing. There's a quick summary of the major types of IMF programs you could go into. The one that we usually will normally get is the ECF. That comes from the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. It's a different window they used to get the money to give out. The ECF, yes, has more conditions attached, but the conditions are generally related to whether or not you are reforming, so you don't come back again asking for more money. The others, for instance, the RCF, which a lot of countries have got now, often don't come with any conditionalities. In fact, you have to ask yourself, the government during COVID has taken 2 billion from IMF, right? So if the same government is complaining about IMF, it makes no sense. What were the conditions attached to that $2 billion? So there was no conditions because of the nature of that package. So it's not automatic that if you go to IMF, you get conditionalities. But if your situation is bad, then yes, you don't get a good product. Some of their products are less stringent than others. So that's the real issue. But the bigger discussion is about the fact that are we going to stop borrowing or not? Mm-hmm. Because I showed you the numbers. How much the government insists on still having to borrow. Even with this 80 billion tax thing, it's still expecting to borrow 50-something billion, right? Locally and internationally. So it will still borrow.
All right.
So if the government will still borrow, then the only thing we have to check is which borrowing is safer. This is the Euro bond that they normally go for. Today, even if they reform their immediate issues and they went back to Euro bond, they won't get less than 9%. If you went to IMF, the worst you could get is maybe 2%. So that's important. Mm-hmm. That's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. Secondly, if you go in there and you go and ensure that you've raised money at that 9% and you bring it in, there'll be less accountability. They will not force you to publish anything. IMF will force you to publish all that information. So people like you and I will have more insight. So the key point is that so long as the government will keep borrowing, we have to look at the cost differential between IMF and other options. That's the way to look at it, not whether or not you go to IMF or whether the IMF is good or that's not a debate. Will you keep borrowing? Then what is the options? You get domestic market borrowing. Mm-hmm. You will get Eurobond borrowing. Are they cheaper than IMF? The conditionality and those things too has to be benchmarked against what you lose in the interest rate.